Headlines. Let us begin with the Financial Times. It looks at how strong the US dollar is and how that is impacting upon markets and currencies around the world. On Monday, you'll remember the price of oil dropped to a 5-year low. Emerging market currencies, some of those fell to 14-year lows.
Hey, Nags, I'll tell you what's not dropping. The Telegraph says China's stock market boom has reached outright mania. We're talking about the Shanghai Composite Index. It's risen by 32% in 6 weeks to 3.5-year high.
Wowzers. According to a think tank report in The Guardian, the UK economy would have been around 20% bigger had the gap between rich and poor not widened in the 1980s. It says that governments should make sure that wealthier individuals pay their fair share of taxes.
And the Business Standard reports on the alleged rape of a woman by an Uber taxi driver in Delhi. According to the paper, Uber does not currently have consistent background checks for drivers in India.
Singapore Airlines has decided to honour hundreds of underpriced business class tickets sold at economy class prices in Australia. That's made the front page of the Business Times.
Yeehaw. And here you go. If you're a bloke, you may be glad to hear this news from the front page of the Telegraph, because scientists have proof, yes, they have proof, they say, that every man needs a good night out with the lads, with his male friends.
I think if you're a bloke, that might be good news. If you're his partner, that may not be such good news.
But
anyway, we'll talk about it in a bit. This is Mark Davies, CEO of strategy consultancy Camberton, who's with us. Good morning.
Morning.
So this is something on the front page of the Financial Times. It's something we've touched upon. We spoke about this this time 24 hours ago. But we're taking a look now at how a stronger dollar is affecting emerging market currencies, as well as the falling oil price also having an impact. How are you looking at this?
Yeah, it was a long time ago now, but they're talking about 14 years. I was trading the bond markets when the Russia crisis struck in '98, and the impact of the strong dollar at that point, and the way that bonds both gapped out. I mean, since then, there's been so much that's happened in the markets that has been really high profile. People have forgotten it. But the impact on Russia at the time was obviously very significant. And looking at this, I think to myself, it's just in here, one small paragraph about the potential impact on Russia, which is, of course, already struggling with the sanctions that it's got over the Ukraine. But I worry more about sort of the geopolitical situation and the impact of the strong dollar and the falling oil price. They talk about emerging currencies because they're the ones who hit the 14-year low. But the general impact of the strong dollar is dislocating the world economy. Which the Americans are doing extremely well, the emerging markets are doing badly, and Russia is really, really struggling.
Yeah. What's interesting about this, in this twist we keep talking about, and I was just talking about it on the World Business Report, the drop in oil, we're around about $65 a barrel. But for those, so oil is still much cheaper than the peak in this summer, but oil's priced in US dollars, so these countries who are importing, buying, will be paying a little bit more because they've got the value of the US dollar is up.
Yes, there is that. Obviously, that's a positive. But equally, there are a lot of economies that are predicated on a higher price of oil. And it's come from $100 down to $65. It has been in free fall over recent weeks. So I think the impact is, for some of the emerging economies is really quite bad news.
When you use words like free fall, for the oil price, does that imply that the market is worried? That you are worried?
Well, some people in the market are worried, depending if you're
I suppose, but when you say free fall, it always implies there's a lack of control. There's a lack of even any foresight about what's going to happen with the oil price. Is it fair to say that it's completely unpredictable now what's going to happen?
Well, it seems to be going one way. I think that's the problem. If it were less predictable, I think it would probably be less problematic.
That's right. It's a supply and demand.
But it's something that the market doesn't seem to be on top of. Whereas before, when we saw oil prices rising, everyone said, we know where this is going. Whereas now, no one seems to be able to predict the bottom when it comes to oil.
No, it's when it looks like it's heading for zero, and clearly it won't actually get to zero. But when it just seems to be going down and down and down with no obvious support, that's when it becomes problematic.
And we know OPEC, for example, could have the power, but they had the meeting, only a week or so ago, and decided not to cut production. Should we move on and talk about... What do you think is driving the China stock market? I'm just wondering. I mean, there's a lot of things going on in China with the economy. I'm wondering if this is people saying, well, no, where are we going to put our money?
It's partly that. I suspect also there's a momentum issue here, that exactly the opposite of what we were talking about with the oil price, that when things start to go up, people buy it just because it's going to go up.
Yeah.
And therefore, the buys drive the buys, and before you know it, you've got a 32% rise in 6 weeks. Interestingly, on this one, it's still way, way off what it was. It's only just gone through 3,000, the Shanghai index. It was over 6,000 before the Lehman Brothers crisis. So, people talk about the fact that it has gone up dramatically, but it's gone up from a pretty low. It was down 2/3 from its peak at one point. So, exactly the opposite impact. I think you're right, though. It's a question of where people are putting their money. I wonder whether there's been an impact. It's a little bit parochial here, but there was a big change, obviously, in top-end property tax here in the UK. And there was a lot of Chinese money going into property before, and the cost of buying property has increased by 2.5 times now at the top end in the UK. And I wonder whether some of the Chinese money that was coming here actually is no longer coming here because it's not quite so obvious that UK property is a good thing to be investing in, and therefore they're putting it into the Chinese stock market.
Let's go to a completely different end of the wealth scale, shall we? When we're talking about people who can afford to buy London properties and they're going up ridiculous rates. The Guardian newspaper has taken a look at a report by the OECD, and what this says is that trickle-down economics, which was a theory employed by Margaret Thatcher, many politicians believe that if there's wealth at the top, it will trickle down to those who are less wealthy, and it will be spent in the economy, and everyone benefits. That hasn't worked, and that there's a wealth gap. And if the wealth gap was plugged when it could have been plugged, according to this report, our economy would be in better health now. What do you make of this?
Look, I think it's no surprise that this has appeared in The Guardian, which is a left-wing newspaper, and I think that you might well find exactly the opposite story appearing in a few days' time in The Telegraph, which is a right-wing newspaper, because this is just a copybook left-wing view of the world economies, and there will be somebody from the right-wing view of the world economies who's going to come out with a report who's going to say exactly the opposite. I think the right-wing side of this story would be that when Thatcher and Reagan adopted the policies that they did in the 80s, the world economies were really struggling, that what had happened in the 70s was that nobody had got richer, and that in allowing some people to get richer, they allowed everybody to rise on the rising tide. Obviously, the left-wing view of the world is very different from that. What's interesting on this is that they're very precise in the numbers, and they say, it's grown by this much, and it might have been 2 or 3% more. Over a 25-year period, seems to me that that's quite a difficult thing to pinpoint as precisely as
it's a tricky calculation to make.
Did you say the OECD? I just don't know in your question. Sorry, I was reading. Okay, because it is coming from the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development. But some of the numbers here, you're right. The OECD says the richest 10% of the population now earned 9.5 times the income of the 10% the poorest.
Can we talk about Uber on the Business Standard now? There is an allegation against a taxi driver, against an Uber driver, of raping a woman in Delhi. What this has spurred is a whole look at how businesses, fast-growing businesses, the challenges that are facing them. Now, you advise businesses.
I do advise specifically fast-growing businesses.
Yeah. What do you make of this?
Well, look, this is an interesting one from the perspective of Uber have got two problems. First of all, they're trying to go into countries where they don't have the mechanisms to do the same sort of checks that they've had in the countries that they started, and therefore they're trying to work out how to deal with the systems that they have in front of them. But another problem that all fast-growing businesses have is that copycat companies come along and try and do the same thing, try and offer the same product as you're offering. But in order to make ground on you, the market leader, what they do is they cut corners and try and get a little bit of lead on you. So you, as the market leader, then have the choice as to whether, in order to maintain your position, you cut those same corners, or whether you carry on with the principles that you started. And it's the same issue that all fast-growing early-stage businesses have, and Uber are hitting it with a vengeance at the moment in India.
Let's talk quickly about this. I mean, some of these Aussies grabbed a bargain with Singapore airline tickets. They'd obviously loaded the wrong price in. They were buying business-class tickets at economy fares.
Good for them.
Yeah, so that's exactly what happened. People were buying a business class ticket. It was an economy fare, and when they realised Singapore Airlines, at first they said, sorry, you're going to have to pay the difference or revert to an economy seat. And there was an outcry, and then they said, okay, it's Christmas. You can have the one you bought. So a lot of lucky people are going to go out there.
Some festive cheer. I must say I'm one of those people who goes to a shop and if it's labelled wrongly, too cheaply. So
you'll say, this is how it's labelled.
That's what it says.
Boys, I have to ask you, when was the last time you went out on a
Well,
lads'
not recently
night
enough, I think, is the answer to that.
Not recently enough. See, I've got a feeling you two are going to be playing perhaps a night out now. Because it's a good idea, according to the Telegraph.
I have to go and buy the Telegraph and cut this tiny little article out and stick it on the fridge. Just as a reminder.
How do you think that's going to fly at home?
Basically, so we should explain what the story is. It says that male stress hormone levels increase if you spend too much time with your family or your partner, and reduce if you go out with the lads.
There you go, ladies. You heard it.
I think your partner's are going to have some severe words if you try to put that one on the fridge. Mark, it's always a pleasure having you with us. Mark Davies from Camberton there. Aaron and I will see you very soon. Have a lovely day.